Morning. I'm Margie O'Driscoll, and on behalf of the Center for Innovation in the Design and Construction Industry, I'd like to welcome you here today and have us begin with a few words from our chairman, Stuart Ekblad.
Good morning. Good morning, everyone, and possibly good afternoon to depending on where you are. But first, would just really like to thank everyone for joining us here on day one for the CIDCI, our 2021 Fall Forum. And hopefully everyone is aware that this runs every day this week for about 90-minute sessions, starting here in the morning. So my name is Stuart Ekblad. I'm one of the founders, and I am chair of the CIDCI. A few words about the Center of Innovation. So we got started approximately about 8 years ago. It was just a small group in San Francisco of representatives throughout the industry that just were really curious about what is actually happening with innovation, and how does this start to affect the industry, and how do we get involved in that. And so we have spent several of those years focused on creating a collaborative group, an interdisciplinary group of building owners, architects, engineers, builders, anyone that's at all interested, but who is committed to the industry of the design and construction, with the purpose, of course, of really just improving our built environment. It's not just necessarily building, creating the designs or the construction, but really how do we impact and improve the environment. Our mission is very simple. Basically, we want to be a catalyst to improve the built environment, and we want to inspire innovation. We want people to really think about not just to change things, but how can things be improved? How do we grow and leverage what we already have? Our mission is to facilitate the exchange of ideas, knowledge, insights to address challenges and opportunities in our industry. Moving forward, so about 18 months ago, and it was certainly part of the COVID, we have shifted to a Zoom presentation format for now for these and for our annual conferences. But this has really given us a chance to really involve ourselves with a much wider community. So this has actually worked out really well. And at the same time, we are using we have recorded about 30 different sessions. So we invite you to see those sessions that we've developed both in a local, domestic, and an international audience for these videos. So things that we have discussed, for example, if you're aware, and if you followed us on any of our salons, we've discussed how to remove slavery from the supply chain, building decarbonization, how to create a marketplace for innovation, circular economy, and how innovative women are reshaping the world of design construction, and really much more. But I really encourage you to go to our website and to YouTube, where you can see our salon presentations that have been recorded. And of course, we'd love to get your feedback. We'd love to hear other things that you'd like to hear about, and remind you, it's all free, which is also helps us to really encourage participation. So I'm going to move to the board itself. So the CIDC Board of Directors, we have, this year has been a really important year for us. We've had a chance to move forward to extend our board members, the number of board members, and also their reach in the industry. Our board members are Dean Reed, Howard Ashcraft, Sue Grubel, Larry Hillman, Ian McLaren, Troy Thompson, Patricia Tillman, Rebecca Snelling, Samiha Ergen, Tiet Lee, and KP Redding. And these, as you can see on our slide, represent, for those of you who know, many of those represents a really broad range now of the design construction industry, through academics, through actual products, through just overall leadership in design and construction, and certainly in terms of new and startups. And so I just want to thank those, and personally thank the board. So next, however, we would, unfortunately, Ian McLaren is moving off from the board this year. So I just really want to take a second to personally thank him for the tremendous contributions he's made over the years And so, Ian, thank you so much for your participation and leadership as we have been able to grow. Finally, so CIDCI does offer a newsletter and free online webinars for our community of innovators. We would love to hear from you. And anyone here on that you can see a picture here, please contact them if you know them, or if you don't know them, please contact them anyway. And really, we would just love to hear how can CIDCI best to innovate, to accelerate innovation. How can we bring it to you? How can we stimulate that new thinking, new ideas? So we are a community, and we can't thank our sponsors enough, especially for this year's forum. And Bosch, thank you so much for supporting this particular event. Really do appreciate this, and not just, of course, your support, but the participation, and will be one of the sessions in this next 5 days. I think everyone knows we live in a time when innovation really happens in lots of different ways, but we do have something exciting in terms of today and over the next 4 days of our forum. So we do plan to spend a couple of minutes of areas of videos of things that we have found in the community that, in particular in the nonprofit world, that we might all find really, I think, one, challenging and very exciting. So with that, we're going to introduce basically a Bay Area's own Girls Garage. Please enjoy this video.
We're gonna wait till it stops. High five, that was awesome.
Welcome to Girls Garage in Berkeley, California, where young girls are learning how to use some seriously big power tools.
Leave it down till it stops. Woo! Nice job.
What was important to you about founding a place that was just for girls?
I think there are not enough places in the world where girls feel both safe and empowered to be brave, where there's a true community of girls and women that come together and say, this is our place, we're gonna do this thing, and it's gonna be awesome.
Emily Piloton fell in love with building when she was a teenager. She grew up to be an architect with a passion for encouraging other girls to pursue design, which led her to launch the garage.
When did you create this space?
So Girls Garage started in 2013 as an experiment. It was a summer camp that I ran for 2 weeks, and it sold out in a matter of days.
After the success of that trial run, Emily knew she was onto something.
So that told me, A, I wasn't crazy. B, there were other girls like me and young girls who wanted to do this thing. It really blew my mind, like how much energy and excitement they brought to it, and how energized I was about being in a community of just girls.
Soon, Girls Garage became her full-time job. The program teaches construction basics to girls ages 9 through 17, and even has a special workshop for girls to build and bond with their moms.
Why do you think the moms were so eager to get involved?
There is a generation of moms who will come in and say, you know, I wanted to take shop class in high school, but I couldn't because it was only for boys. For some moms, there's a little bit of, you know what, I'm going to learn this now, and I'm going to do it with my daughter.
I joined one of Emily's recent sessions, where mothers and daughters learn to construct a toolbox using drills, drivers, jigsaws, bandsaws, and more.
If I put my blade on the side I measured, what's going to happen?
It's going to be too short.
It's going to be too short, yeah.
Is it cool to see your daughter holding like big power tools?
I love it. And it's just seeing how happy and confident she is doing it.
Are you proud of yourself?
Yeah, I think that I did a pretty good job.
Emily's own mom even took in her first official class at the garage.
Awesome. So good.
Well, it's inspiring, and I wish all students, but particularly young girls, have a chance to do this kind of work.
Girls Garage has now taught over 400 girls and has a wait list of 200 more. But for Emily, it's about more than just knowing how to use the tools. It's also about realizing your own potential.
I love teaching girls about tools. Their entire demeanor changes. They stand taller. You go from, oh, I'm this 9-year-old girl to, oh my God, I'm a 9-year-old girl who knows how to build. And that just completely changes the way you think about what you're capable of.
You're really changing these girls' lives.
I think so. I hope so. And I think also this is a place that I know I needed when I was a kid. I wish that this place existed when I was a kid. So I'm definitely living vicariously through my girls, and it's the construction crew I always wanted to have.
Well, hopefully everyone really enjoyed that. And I think this is just one example of really some great things that are going on in our industry. and speaking specifically to innovation and how it's going to impact the future of design construction. So hopefully you enjoyed that, and we'd like to find more and more of those and bring those to CIDCI. So please let us know as well if you find those. So, but now I'd like to move on with the session for today and introduce you to Peter Leyden and move forward with his presentation, which the history of the future 2020 to 2050. So Peter, with that, welcome Peter, and thank you.
Yeah, great to be here, honestly. We're going to get you a heck of a presentation today. Again, it's great to be here with you folks today. I understand there's an audience that's some people all across America. There's folks in Europe, I guess in England, there's people in Zurich, there's people in Brazil from all I understand. So it's great that I have both an American and a global audience for this conversation. I'm coming to you from San Francisco, Silicon Valley, a place that I kind of came to more than 25 years ago to work with the early founders of Wired magazine, which was kind of on to this early days of the digital revolution and explaining that emerging future to folks. And so, but it's also an honor to be speaking to the Center for Innovation in the Design and Construction Industry. Honor for several reasons. I mean, really, the construction industry is actually going through its own transformation. Certainly the kind of digital transformation that so many other industries have also been through in the last 25 years. You're going through that transformation, but you're also going to be a critical part in essentially the transformation we're going to see around climate change. In all the kind of new infrastructure we're going to have to build. There's also big challenges of the 21st century around, let's say, housing. Almost all major cities, certainly in America, but all through the world are facing real severe housing crunches. Many of the things that the things that you folks are involved with are instrumental and totally integral to the transformation I'm going to be talking to you about today. Now, we got a lot to talk about today. As you can see here from the thing, I'm going to basically tell you here in short, I'm going to tell you what I think is really going on in the world right now, what I think is coming very soon. It's going to come in the next 10 to 30 years across the next, starting now for the next 30 years. And I'm going to talk to you about the kind of things you should probably do. Now you can just hear me out and listen through to this whole idea, but it's going to be a big and ambitious agenda. I'm going to basically explain what I think is we are already in a kind of world historical transformation. That's what we're calling it, the transformation. And I think in the next 30 years here are going to be an amazing 30 years. And so what I'm going to try to lay out to you to stimulate your thinking, to open up your ideas, to kind of get you thinking big picture, is to tell you what I think is going to be kind of the future history of the world for the next 30 years. A largely positive story, by the way, I'm going to basically push here so that you can get it. Now, what's interesting is there's been a kind of intriguing timing of this conversation because Apple Television just recently launched their new television series called The Foundation. But it's based on the Foundation series, a famous series by Isaac Asimov, one of the founders of kind of really modern science fiction. And it is a story that is set in the very distant future when we're actually in space and kind of be able to travel across the galaxy. It's that kind of long-term vision. And the whole series that Asimov wrote out was a 1,000-year story, basically. And because of that reason, basically no one has ever attempted to do this in video. No one has ever attempted to try a film about it or even television show because of the scope of it, until Apple just launched it just literally a couple of weeks ago. And so they're going to try to do one of these epic Game of Thrones kind of television series. Now, what's interesting for you folks and why it's kind of irrelevant here is the main character there, this is the guy, Harry Seldon, essentially come up with an idea of psychohistory. It's a way of actually understanding big data and using kind of artificial intelligence, think of it as, to actually parse out what is really going to happen in the future. And literally he can predict the future in terms of the story. Now, this is Isaac Asimov in the 1940s, the dawn of mainframe computers, and beginning of just starting to store data, envisioning with a lot of time that we will amass so much data and we'll get so sophisticated in our tools that we'll actually be able to kind of predict the future, is the way he was framing it through this series. Now, it turns out that's not anywhere near predicting the future, but it is interesting. And it's very true that since World War II, there's been an incredible development of a set of tools, an increasing understanding of big data as we kind of slowly built big data to actually get not a prediction of the future, but a much more accurate sense, a much more systematic way of thinking about the future. And there's a series of tools that are used for this, and there's a bunch of approaches to this. And one of the characters in this, who's similar to that character, Harry Seldon from the Foundation series, a guy named Stuart Brand, rooted here. For those who might know Stuart Brand in the Bay Area here, Stuart Brand was the guy who got the world, the NASA, to release the first photo of the Earth from space. He did this, as you can see here, and he put it on the cover of a thing he founded, the Whole Earth Catalog. Here it was in the fall of '68. And it was really one of the key pieces that sparked the entire environmental movement. Now, Stuart Brand has been, he's a character that anyone should tune into and track. But the second big thing he did around futurism is he founded a company called Global Business Network. And it was essentially an early strategic foresight firm that developed some very sophisticated tools around scenario planning, but also ways to kind of more systematically understand the future. And it's a place that I worked with Stuart there and the founders of GBN after my time at Wired. And in fact, got very tuned into this whole idea of how to really, as best we can, understand what's emerging in the near future and give us a better informed idea of what's going to happen. And this kind of thing I'm going to be talking to you today. Stuart has now founded in the last 25 years, a thing called the Long Now Foundation, different foundation. But this is a foundation, again, systematically thinking about the future. And at that place, I also host a kind of civilization salons, which are virtual salons with leading experts and about a dozen people in a conversation in which we're probing 25 years out into the future here, trying to understand the big trends that are going to really transform our world. Something I'm going to draw off of for my talk today. The other thing I'm doing, which is kind of pertinent to you folks, is for basically the last 25 years since my Wired days, I've been doing a lot of speaking. I do a lot of keynotes to kick off business conferences, general conferences, and all kinds of places. And I also do a lot of advising to senior execs, C-suite people, both through America and quite a bit in Europe. And so over the time, I've actually developed a way of taking what I'm learning systematically about the future and actually giving advice, strategic advice to folks. And right now, this last year, I've been working with Autodesk as their senior fellow, which I'm helping them understand the next 10 years, and particularly around what they could do to maximize their impact on climate change. And the things that through that experience, though, I'm able to understand much better your construction industry as well as the other industries they're working on. But I think it's going to be quite relevant to my ability to actually explain to you what I think is happening here and what's going to impact your business in the next 10 to 25 years here. The one thing I'm working most with them right now is essentially an idea that we are essentially coming off a series of interlocking systems that we've been used to for many years, and that we are watching the emergence of a new set of interlocking systems. And what I think of as a strategic sea change is the way I'm kind of talking to them about it. And I want to talk to you folks about it. I'm going to get more into this later, and we'll talk about that in a minute here. But I'm going to kind of kick into the general talk here. Well, starting with the cover of Wired magazine, that was the last issue that ended 2020. Now, this is the magazine I used to run in the heyday in the 1990s, as we talked about or referenced earlier. And look at how bleak this is. I mean, this was essentially about as bleak as they can get. A dark cover. I mean, it was capping a really bleak year, but also the previous decade. Many people, it was in this case the virus, the global pandemic, the economic chaos across that, but it was also coming off an extremely polarized politics and a paralysis of government in the United States. It was also, but people's kind of despair about will we ever be able to solve climate change or do anything to kind of mitigate the runaway heating the planet, what we're going to do about inequality, massive inequality. Young people were pouring into the streets about racial equity. It's issues that just haven't been solved despite decades of trying to work on these things. And there is a general feeling of despair. Now, what I would say about that is essentially the hit is mostly, I think, comes from people looking backwards or kind of essentially not looking forward And I think there is a general sense that many of the systems that were really prevalent or structured our lives for the last 40 years, particularly most people who are maybe watching this, depending on your age, the world you grew up in, the world that you essentially came of age in your career, the last 40 years essentially had a series of interlocking systems. And even if you go back further, the 20th century had, you could even say, had a series of interlocking systems that are buckling right now, and that are really ultimately, I think, on their way to actually really collapsing with time, actually. So for example, our energy systems around carbon have actually gotten us into this crazy predicament. And so that whole system is coming buckling, and we have to kind of move on. The whole system of kind of, wide open free market financial capitalism, has done many amazing things, but it's also kind of created crazy inequalities and a very volatile kind of situation in the global finance. There's a series of things happening in all kinds of different interlocking systems. Our politics, we're just not able to govern. No one's able to. Our democracy itself is reading books where we in the United States, but also throughout the liberal democracies of Europe, are really hitting a place where they're not functioning well. Now, so this is a kind of so there is a sense that's realistic about a kind of a sense of people feeling down about things. Now, but the problem with that is they're not really looking forward. And I think what's really interesting about this moment in time is that there are there are a set of other systems that are emerging right now that are frankly much more positive, much more tuned into the new realities of the 21st century, and much more apt to solve the great challenges of our time, including climate change and including a lot of these seemingly intractable social and political and kind of governing issues. And I'm going to basically talk to you about what I call the positive reframe. It's to really explain to you what I think is emerging out of this, to kind of let go of the things behind us and to try to refocus on what's happening. And this is the decade where that sea change of your strategies has got to happen. And that's what I'm going to talk about to you today. Now, one of the ways I talk about that is to talk about the things that I call the inexorables. These are new technologies, huge new technology, sets of new technologies, but also massive trends that have been working for a while now, have been under development for quite a while, but are hitting the kind of point now where they're starting to really make a fundamental difference and really are fundamentally changing the world. And it's these set of inexorables that are essentially going to create the architecture or infrastructure, essentially, of what this next set of systems is going to be like. And just to give you a flavor of that, we're heading in the next 10 years, universal connectivity. We are going to connect up all 8 billion people on the planet through high bandwidth internet. I'm going to talk about more of this stuff later. We're going to be seeing over that background ubiquitous AI and the capabilities of AI going to everybody, including small construction firms all over the place. We're going to see, because of this, and I'll explain later, a period of accelerated innovation. If you thought innovation has happened at a pretty quick pace, in or outside, you could say the construction industry, it's going to accelerate here, and I'll tell you why. We're going to see a world historical shift to clean energies in the space of the next 30 years. This is going to happen. It's already happening. The tipping point has come, where similarly, we're going to see a shift to electric mobility across not just America and the developed world, but it's going to be throughout the world. In these 30 years, we're seeing from, let's say, that our ability to deal with the pandemic and the quick ability to actually get vaccines out, just the beginning of our kind of understanding of genetic understanding and the impact that's going to have on many, many things. We're just at the very earliest days of synthetic biology, which I'll get to about how important that is in the materials world, which is going to impact you folks very fundamentally on how we build things and what we build those things from. We're also going to see, beyond technologies, a generational shift in politics, which is going to be a sea change in kind of our political orientation in America and throughout the West. And also that could have implications globally. And we're going to see new majorities. I would say a new 60-40 majority that is going to have a lot of clarity in our politics, both in America and in Western Europe, I would say. That will be, instead of this kind of back and forth 50-50 kind of paralyzed world, I think that's shifting. It's going to happen this decade. Boom. Now, you hear me out on this, and I'm going to tell you a bunch of global ones, by the way, for the global people there. This is just a little taste of what's to come. In short, what I'm trying to basically tell you is that we are in, for the next 30 years, a world historical moment of time that will be remembered for a long time. What I basically call, in short, the transformation. And in fact, we're going to have three different technology booms around information technologies, around biotechnologies and around energy technologies that are going to kind of crest through this entire 30 years here. We're also going to, it's going to bring, as all technology booms do, a kind of economic boom that I think is going to dwarf what we saw in the late post-war world. And it's also going to dwarf what we've seen in the last 40 years. In many sectors actually did have a big boom, and a lot of our economy did boom. But I think this is going to be a bigger boom, honestly. And I think because of that, we're going to have the resources and the tools to actually solve the challenges we face, including solving climate change is a little bit too far, but essentially we're going to get a handle on climate change and be able to kind of adapt for it long term. But also a lot of these other issues too are going to be play out in new ways. It's a very positive and kind of positive reframe, essentially on that same kind of future that many people are thinking. The final piece here is, if you think about for the whole century, which is, by the way, anyone who has kids on this call, your kids are going to essentially live till 2100. They're going to see the end of the century. So this is not science fiction, but across their lifetimes, we're going to see something that's closer to essentially a civilizational change. We're going to see essentially such a different ways of doing things, of fundamentally all digital systems. We're going to see sustainable systems, both in environmental ways, but also socially ways. We're going to see kind of working on a global scale, planetary kind of level, kind of essentially living at a planetary level. These kind of fundamental world historical shifts are essentially going to happen. Now, I'm not going to focus too much on this, because we're going to focus on the folks here in the next 10, well, the next literally this next decade and the next 30 years. But ultimately, there is a context that's even bigger that I want you people to keep in mind, which is we are living in a very, very unique time. And I think it will be remembered for many centuries to come. Now, to kind of start this, I would say, well, why would you listen to this guy? I mean, besides a little bit of my positioning on my future chops there and how I've kind of come to your industry, I will say this. I've been through this drill before. And this is when I was back at Wired Magazine. This is a cover story I co-authored with a guy named Peter Schwartz. Essentially, this is kind of mid-90s when we started developing this story, which later, by the way, went into a book and went into multiple languages. And it's something I spoke about for about a decade off this thing. But essentially back then, we faced a similar situation, which is these little goofball digital technologies and these little crazy little goofball startups. Is like no one understood how was that going to fill out into the digital revolution? How is that going to, this new early globalization, how is that going to knit together the world in new ways? And so what essentially me and my co-author did is we essentially wrote a history of the future, which we called the long boom, a history of the future. We told the story from 1980 to 2020, which from that point of view is about 25 years in the future. And what we did is explain how this was actually going to play out. And it was a largely positive story. And it eventually got us to this place that, in fact, a lot of the pieces of the puzzle, not all, but many of the pieces that we laid out to people 25 years ago came to play. So you say, well, how did we actually do on that? Well, I'll tell you. So one of the things we were saying was, hey, these little computer chips have been actually doubling in processing power every 2 years. This is a Moore's law kind of thing. You get twice as many integrated chips, integrated circuits on a chip, and it doubles the power, and it also drops the cost, and it shrinks the size, frankly. We said, this is going to continue. There seems to be something, and in fact, it did continue. And this is essentially from the 70s, and even by the mid-90s, it wasn't clear it was going to keep going, but in fact, it did keep going. This is the actual numbers, by the way. All that I'm going to show you here is the actual numbers as we hit 2020. Now, this is a logarithmic scale, if you see there on the left, how that is. Meaning every time you go up a line there, it's 10 times. The scale is moving 10 times up. And that's because people have a hard time understanding what doubling is. And I'll just kind of remind you, this is the doubling. If you're watching here on my slide, each one of those is a doubling. And in the beginning of doublings, you see these minor things, but okay, we already got to the top of the slide. So you got to switch that. So, okay, there's a doubling. And then, okay, well, you got to do it again to do another doubling, boom. And this is doubling, by the way, every 2 years for more than 40 years, actually 50 years it's been going on here. But eventually you got to go up, double your screen, and then it goes through your ceiling, and then it goes through, 2 stories up, and then it goes 4 stories up. And this doublings get crazy at the end. And this has been going on in terms of the computer power for all this year. Now, the flip side is, as you get more and more power, things get cheaper. And so the logarithmic scale works downward as well. So here's one good example. The gigabytes that you all have on your cell phones or whatever it is on your computers. In 1980, 1 gigabyte cost $700,000. And it's about a penny today. And that's because it's come down this cost curve. Now, the reason I'm kind of showing this is happening again in energy and all kinds of stuff we're going to be seeing here. But I'm just saying, hey, this actually prediction worked out. Boom. Basically, gigabytes is super cheap. We said the same thing back in 95, mid 90s. There was only 25 million people on the planet on the internet. It was basically a bunch of Americans, and a lot of them in San Francisco. And then we said, well, this is going to connect up, and eventually it's going to be by 2020, you're going to have, more than half the people on the planet on this. In fact, that's exactly what happened. We got about 60% of the planet is now connected through the internet. Again, now this brings up another thing, which is going to come up again in all these new things I'm going to show you here, is essentially the technology adoption curve. This is a thing that happens with all technologies, all successful ones. Not all technologies are successful, but you always see an early period where you get innovators kind of playing, but it's a really slow ramping up. Then you get the kind of early adopters that say, hey, there's something interesting here. Then when it gets ready for prime time, you start to go, oh, wow, there's an early majority that jumps on the new thing early. And then eventually there's the late majority that just, hey, follows the pack. And ultimately the laggards kind of come up who, you can't even get, let's say, a black and white television anymore. It's all got to be color. Anyhow, this happens all the time. The key thing is watching that tipping point. That is essentially what the whole game is in Silicon Valley at some level. And anyone thinking about the future is, where is the tipping points coming? And in fact, that's the thing I've been studying for the last 25 years. A lot of these tipping points are happening now in these things beyond digital technologies, which we'll get to here. The thing about when you get a tech boom like that, you're going to get essentially economics around that tech boom. And so we saw the rise of Apple. Apple, when my story came out in the mid 90s there, Apple was on its back. It was about 3 months away from the month it came out, 3 months away from bankruptcy. And they begged Steve Jobs to come back and take over as CEO. And that was kind of, look at that number there. That was kind of in the mid 90s there when their market cap was nothing. And it was only about the iPhone in 2007 when the vision of Jobs finally clicked in and the ability to actually play it off. And look, they became the first $1 trillion company. And again, right, just shot through the roof. But again, it wasn't just them. By 2020, this marking point here, basically all the top companies in the world, the commanding heights of the global economy, were dominated by American tech companies, West Coast tech companies, and really rooted in Silicon Valley tech companies, with Seattle as a kind of a secondary place. And essentially this, and as we know, this has only continued. And it's only going to continue here. So something fundamental happened around that thing, in fact, which we predicted. We said these goofball little companies are going to be basically running the world. But it wasn't just the tech sector. We watched the entire GDP growth. That little dip at the end there is the pandemic, which is a blip, and we know it's coming back here. We also, wasn't just America and the developed world. It was like China went from this 2-bit goofball place that was struggling with all their peasants in poverty, to essentially, a $15 trillion company by the 2020, and the second, or $15 trillion country GDP, and the second most powerful country and the second biggest economy in the world. It wasn't also just China. I mean, the entire global GDP for the entire world, again, with the little blip there at the pandemic, but basically, this drove booms. New industries like this, big industries drive booms. And in fact, as you'd expect, stock market boom. And again, at the time when we wrote this, the mid 90s, the Dow Jones is about 5,000. And people around us, not so much us, but we're saying, hey, if these things play out the way they're going to play, the Dow is going to be 30,000. There was literally a book called Dow 30, I think 36,000. And people laughed at it. That was crazy. It's like, this is impossible. In fact, as we know, we hit 30,000. The Dow by the end of 2020. So anyhow, the reason I'm kind of telling this to you is, like, there is a way to do this. And in fact, if you take the same techniques and these same kind of tools, you can actually look ahead into our next 25 years, or roughly the next 30 years, that'll get us to 2050s, which is what I've done here. And so what I'm going to do here is do a quick, as best we can here. We have a good hour. I'm going to try to touch on, these are the kind of technology, essentially, the 3 different technology waves that we're going to see here. I'm going to do a quickie on all this, give you a little smidgen of data. I'll just give you a little sense of what I'm talking about, but ultimately know that there's essentially an argument for all this. Now, the one here, universal connectivity, is literally in 2000, basically, there was mostly about 1/3 of Americans were online. And even in Europe, it wasn't that well penetration in terms, except for way northern Europe, the internet. By 2030, we will essentially have everybody on the planet connected. Right now, this decade, we're watching already these kind of like Elon Musk, among others, is Starlink kind of set of satellites out there, but there's many competing ones. Essentially, you will be able to get high bandwidth internet from every corner of the planet. And essentially, the cost will be driven down in many, many ways. And so basically, we'll in the first time in the history of the world, we'll have every single human being connected on the planet in the next 10 years. I mean, that's kind of just crazy when you think about it. And just to kind of lay out the numbers on that is right now, like I say, we have about 60% of the world is online. This is our internet users, and look at billions on the bottom there. But these are all the people that still have to come. Half of Asia still has to come online. About 2/3 of Africa and the Middle East, and about 40% of Latin America. I know there's some people in Brazil down there on this talk, but think about that. And there's still a little cleanup, you know, on basic the developed areas of Europe and North America. But the point is, this is happening. It is inexorable, but this is inevitable. It's going to happen. And so again, if anybody who has any inklings of any kind of global business, think about you've just added 3 billion new potential users. Anyhow, something to keep in mind. Now, this is the other thing I was going to say here. This is a little cruder slide that I threw this together quickly, but about the construction industry. So I'll just say this. Not only is everyone getting connected, but essentially all industries are going to be digital to kind of coincide with this. And so there is also a kind of a lag time in what they call in the kind of consulting industry or the general industry, the digital transformation. And, you know, that hit the media industries first, and it's kind of systematically gone through a bunch of different industries. It's something I've been tracking, you know, literally for my career, 25 years here. And it's finally hitting the construction industry, and it's hitting also kind of very physically oriented industries. Healthcare is starting to get hit bad here. Government is starting to get digitized in new ways that it hadn't been. Anyhow, there's essentially a bit of a lag time in depending on where your industry is and how easily digitized it is. But you guys are there. Now, one of the things I just want to point out is with your productivity, I know this has been an issue across the board, but it is really interesting that when your productivity kind of lost sync with the rest of the productivity of the other industries, it was right around 1980, which was the beginnings of PCs and computers. You guys, to my understanding, from what I'm understanding through all these different ways, are very not as digitized and have a long way to go. And although they're on the cusp of it, and you can kind of see, I would say, you know, there's probably other reasons for this, but one of the key reasons is you just haven't been able to take advantage of these insanely powerful, incredible kind of efficiencies around these kind of network tools. And the kind of things you can do and get rid of all kinds of human labor, basically, because of the power of these things. Anyhow, so I expect your productivity will start clicking in as you start introducing these more tightly. Ubiquitous AI. You know, I talked about the digital revolution up to here, and I just literally referenced there, just getting the basic kind of foundation back on. But what's coming in the next 10 years is essentially the next wave of digital transformation, which is essentially going to be the adoption of artificial intelligence, AI. And that AI will become not just a niche in certain kind of industries, but it is essentially going to be ubiquitous. It'll be and it'll be accessible to all kinds of places, small business people, all kinds of people will be able to get it through this kind of network that's going to connect up all the humans in the world. One example, you can just start to see, if you do take, you know, corporations that actually are starting to really put the investments in this, you're starting to see the projections of how a lot of the AI enterprise market is taken off. But essentially, that's going to continue to keep going and through all kinds of different industries. Now, the flip side of these two developments I just described is we're going to get accelerated innovation. And I know you guys are folks on the innovation in these industries. So I'll just spend a second here on this. There's two things going on here. Innovation often comes from essentially the cross-fertilization of people from different backgrounds, disciplines, perspectives coming together to work on a common problem. And it's in that kind of milieu of different perspectives, often you see innovation happen. And what's going to happen when you connect up the world, and when one of the biggest developments of essentially AI is going to be essentially simultaneous language translation. You're already getting close to it, where you're starting to see these services that get pretty close to translating these early crude kind of versions of it. But in the next decade, we will essentially make it so that it'll be natural language translation simultaneously, whether you're talking over a video like this or whether you got a bud in your ear and you're walking through a market in Bangkok. You're basically going to be able to hear everybody and understand everyone with nuance and subtlety. And that is going to open up the amount of people to innovate with and to cross-fertilize perspectives all over, you'll see everything in China, everything in Farsi, everything else you'll be able to tap into. And this is an actually interesting piece of information. So if you take the world right now, English speakers, this is the common lingua franca now, particularly in the business world. But if you really take other languages, including Chinese, Spanish, Hindi, Arabic, I mean, how many of you who speak English can speak Arabic or Hindi or Spanish? Well, or Chinese. Not many. And the flip side is, but what we're going to watch is essentially the ability to access all that data, all those science papers, all those patents, everything else that's done in those kind of languages, you'll see, and vice versa. It's going to open up people who in Hindi, a kind of a poor kid in a village in, India will actually be able to kind of watch the MIT online course, whatever. It's going to be a crazy amount of kind of stimulation of innovation. The other last thing I'll say about innovation, since you guys are so into this, is innovation has gone from an art to a science, or more like from an art to more like a science in the last 25 years. Everything from design thinking, all kinds of things like lean startups and how do you A/B test and all kinds of things. There's a lot of things that we've systematically kind of figured out how to innovate better. And an entire generation of students now are just come out of college or come out of school, certainly come out of grad work, with a much a sophistication in innovation that many of us who started the business, many years ago, many decades ago, didn't have. We had to kind of figure it out on the fly, or it was not really categorized. It wasn't really kind of systematized in the same way. That's going to speed up innovation as well. Shifting quickly to energy. So that was kind of the information technologies. There's also the clean energy kind of space, which is a fundamental world historical shift from all carbon energies to pretty much most clean energies. And this is going to happen in the next 30 years, and it's certainly going to happen through the century here. But this is a crazy thing. But again, it's following the line of digital technologies. In fact, solar cells have a lot kind of in common with digital cells. And in fact, what you had is a similar price thing, dropped to what I showed you on gigabytes. Basically, it was close to about $76, $76 what was that, a gigawatt we're charging here? The cost dollars per watt, $76 a watt. And basically now it's essentially free. Or not free, but it's like pennies. And so that same thing has happened in this 40 years behind us, to the point now where these are starting to take off. Solar, in fact, has dramatically from its early origins, has grown about 20 times. It's starting to hit that hockey stick. We're starting to watch the early adopters, and it's starting to go into mass early majority, and all that stuff's happening. The takeoff has happened. And in fact, it's even hit exponential growth. So it's in that same category for the last 20 years. If you take from the 90s to now, it's starting to actually go up in that logarithmic scale. This is a classic example. There's versions of this in other kind of technologies around clean energy, but let's just use that. Don't have the time to go into it. Same thing about electric mobility. We are watching essentially the same thing driven by new technologies. You had that same cost drop was coming down for batteries. Batteries are the key technology you had to figure out there. They were expensive in 2010. They've gone down substantially to really cost effective now with internal combustion engines as of 2020, but they're continuing to go down because as you scale up any kind of technology, you're able to bring out costs and kind of squeeze out much more efficiencies. And so we're expected to go down to another 3 to 5 times. It's going to go down by 2030. And then they're cheaper. In fact, they're thinking in the next 2 to 3 years, they will be cheaper than internal combustion engines and better because there's no maintenance, there's safer, there's all kinds of stuff around the thing. And of course, they're better for the environment. So we're watching this sea change of happening. So again, powered by Tesla to kind of break the whole industry out of their addiction to internal combustion and oil and gas. They basically have started the ramping up. And now we're watching all the major industries, all the major car players doing it. So anyhow, again, the same pattern's happening. Want to shift quick to the other third world historical shift in biotechnologies. Genetic understanding being one of the key ones. And this is essentially once you understand our genes, the genetic human genome, but also the genes of anything, including, let's say, a virus, like the COVID virus, we can actually, within literally the day that we find a new mutated virus, we can get the entire genome. We know exactly what it's doing, and we can track exactly, as you know, this is how it's happening. This couldn't have happened until today. I mean, we're lucky that the pandemic hit in 2020 and not like literally 20 years ago. 20 years ago, just to crack one human genome, it cost $2 billion, and it was essentially an effort that took about 15 years. Since that time, the costs of sequencing a human genome have come down in a logarithmic scale. This is that log scale, faster than Moore's law. In other words, in 20 years, it's did kind of more what Moore's law would have taken 40 years to do. In other words, these costs are falling so dramatically that we're essentially, it's gotten now to where you can get a full human genome for about $1,000. It's soon going to be $100. And pretty soon, and by 2030 or beyond, it'll be just free. I mean, it'll essentially be so easy, it'll just be baked into everybody's healthcare around the planet. This is just not science fiction. We figured out how to do this. And it opens up all kinds of things around human health, human understanding, but it also opens up for you folks, I want to get into it here, synthetic biology, or what, the broader way to think of it is biological engineering. Because alongside this, we now know how to manipulate these genes. This whole CRISPR, if you've heard of the CRISPR kind of technique, CRISPR is like very simple in many respects, super low cost, a technique that was pretty much discovered in kind of, let's say, 2012, 2013, 2014 in that space academically. Here in Berkeley, actually, UC Berkeley was one of the key places in that. But basically now it's very simple technique that we know we can actually edit any genes, frankly, including human genes, although that starts to get ethically difficult. But we're able to do it with any living organism, whether it's plant, animal, you name it. And in fact, that's now opening up a whole field of what we call synthetic biology. Synthetic biology is essentially, if you can genetically engineer wood to be more heat resistant, to be stronger, and to, you can do this not just by breeding and taking decades to do that, like the old days. It's like you just do it. And in fact, it's opening up a whole world of how so much of the world is essentially, grown things, wood and others, cotton, all kinds of things that, well, not cotton for building, but anyhow, the point is this is going to go through a fundamental change. One example of this you can see is in meat, because beef is such a difficult stress on the environment because of the methane and the CO2 that comes out from beef, basically cattle. There's been a lot of push on how do we actually grow essentially not just alternatives like Impossible Burgers, which are essentially taking plant-based things to make it taste like beef, but this is essentially cultured meat, which is you take a cell from the actual beef, or for that matter, fish or pork, whatever you want to do, and you essentially grow it in a vat. It's the same cell, so it would taste the same. It essentially just, you put directly the amino acids and all the things that it takes a cow to kind of eat and to drink and to roam around to do its thing. So much of that is wasted to get the actual pound of beef. This way you just do it in the vat. This is a true thing. It's happening. There's startups at it. It's expensive right now, but again, just like any of these, it's scaling. And so by 2040, we're looking at what's cultured meat. This is what that is, that's cell-based meat. Could be a significant part of the market, but in fact, conventional meat will be phased out. And this again is the AT Kearney analysis that we're borrowing here and crediting there in the bottom there. But anyhow, this is not science fiction, it's happening. The way to just kind of sum this up, I just want to say, is that if you got an information technology boom with AI and connecting up 3 billion more people, and you got a kind of biotech boom going around this new fields of synthetic biology and the revolution in healthcare, and then you got a clean energy boom, which is we're taking the entire energy system of the world and moving it into essentially a totally different energy system. There is a lot of business opportunities there, folks. There's going to be a lot of money made. That is going to be not just a long boom like we've been through the last 40 years here around the digital revolution and first phase of globalization. It's going to be a crazy boom, in my opinion. Things can go wrong and you can't always count on it, but you got to open your mind up to this possibility. Now, shifting here quick, because I want to throw a few more things on the table here for you folks, is these are the kind of there's a couple that are not technology based that I think you want to think about, a generational shift and these new majorities here. And I'm going to focus more on America, but it also has implications for Europe, for folks there and all over the world. I just don't know I don't have the understanding of the demographics in the same way I do here. But I will say this, we're watching a fundamental shift between the power and influence of essentially two huge generations. The baby boom generation, which has dominated things for the last 40 years, politics, culture, economics, they're fading out. And essentially we're watching the rise of the millennial generation. Roughly their children essentially are essentially an equally big generation, by the way, are actually on ascendant here. And this is going to have profound changes on all kinds of things, political, policy, all kinds of things, economics as well. Now, I just want to give you a little sense of this to drive home in data how this works. This is the American population right now by generation. And if you look at the millennials, they're almost age 40 now, and they're about, kind of 24 or so there. This is 2020, sorry, when I was trying to line up all these things along that 2020 grid. But here's the thing, that's the kind of, age 20, you're entering into the functioning, economy and things like that, 65 generally retiring. So look at the baby boomers are already kind of sliding out, and not only sliding out of work, but actually dying off. I mean, it's just what happens. I mean, in this ages. If you just push this out to 2030, basically all baby boomers are retirement age or beyond. And the millennials and this Gen Z behind them, a smaller generation in terms of the peak of the millennials, but those two generations are very similar in their attitudes towards climate change, towards racial inequality, towards they miss the booms of the past. So like they're actually all about much more about more inequality issues around the economy. Anyhow, you're watching this essentially dominance in politics around America, but it'll also be throughout Europe. It's going to be that, not this baby boom thing that's been driving things for the last 40 years. This is a huge shift you got to think about. If you just put it out to 2040, same thing. By that time, there isn't a baby boomer around barely to kind of, vote for Trump, Donald Trump, for example, right now. So that thing is going out in a way that I think it's just worth hearing. And eventually by 2050, the world, we don't know what the generations behind that are going to be like. But anyhow, this is a thing that's going to happen. It's inexorable. Demographics is inexorable. The other thing about new majorities is how do you form essentially big coalitions of 60-40 coalitions that drive fundamental change, transformative change? And I think we're in one now. And I think a lot of it has to do with essentially the new majorities around people of color. In this country, in America. It's a little less so in Europe, but it has its own version of that. But if you go back essentially to 2020, we basically hit immigration rates that were comparable to what happened in the early part of the 20th century, to what we think of as the heyday of European immigration to the United States. We hit those levels. That's as a percentage. And in terms of real numbers, since the size of the United States is so much bigger, real numbers are essentially much bigger than what we remember from the old Ellis Island days. The other thing which is going on is essentially since the 60s and a kind of a new regime of global immigration, which wasn't preferencing European immigration, you're watching essentially inexorably white people becoming down as a percentage of the American population and people of color going up. This is roughly where it was in 2020. And in fact, it is inexorably going, it's probably gonna hit before 2050, it's probably more like 2045. And this is essentially where California is already today, is at that little tip there, where white people are a minority of the state and people of color are the majority combined of the state. And Hispanics, in fact, are the biggest group in California per se, bigger than the white population. Anyhow, this is the future coming to all Texas and all kinds of places around the country. Here in Europe, again, has its own kind of version. The other thing that's happening is education is going up. This is a prediction out to basically 2050, but clearly higher education is going to be baked into many more people's lives, even secondary education going a little bit up. And so you're going to see a more highly educated populace. So this coalition of where is the population going seems to be going behind essentially not a conservative kind of framework on politics, which was kind of last represented by Trump, and into something else that's emerging here. And without getting too partisan, I'm just trying to basically lay out to you objectively, I think, what I think, or close to objectively, what I think you should be prepared for, regardless of your own personal politics. You should be thinking, this is probably going to happen. And I would give it in a big scale. Politics has cycles. We saw a progressive cycle both in America and Europe in terms of the building of the New Deal, Great Society kind of period after World War II, same thing, welfare state in Europe. We then, with Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher and all that, we saw essentially a conservative era, generally more pro-business, more kind of focus on freedom, less kind of distribution and infrastructure kind of investments and things. And I would argue that, in fact, given that coalition of who's coming and where the millennials and others want to go, we're going to see something closer to what is essentially a progressive era. Again, big investments in things like climate and other kinds of things, probably some kind of redistribution or kind of rechanneling of wealth in society, things like that. Again, set aside your own politics and just kind of think about the possibility that this is what's going to structure your businesses and how you're going to, the society is going to live in coming in the next 30 years here. The other thing along the inexorable digitization was the inexorable globalization going on here. And I want to kind of just end this kind of overview by also going a little bit more global. Here's an example. It's not just digital things that went global. For example, this is travel to essentially around the world in that last 40-year period. And look at where in 1980, there was a bunch of kind of maybe Western, college kids banging around and Australians kind of checking out things. There was a scene that was globally traveling, but essentially nothing like what happened over the course of that 4-decade kind of period where the world just got knitted together. And there doesn't seem to be, although the pandemic is slowing that down, I think in many respects, this is a small planet that's going to be knit together for a long time to come. And so I think it's worth talking about essentially a set of global inexorables just to kind of open your mind. And it does have some implications for the construction industry, I think, too, particularly if you have any kind of global aspirations from an American firm or if you're working abroad. And that one inexorable is climate change, capital. I'm going to get into each of these just quickly. Chinese power, basically total urbanization, which is a big one on your construction world, middle-class majorities, and then basically the rise of women here. And I'll do this relatively quickly because now I don't want to spend a lot of time on climate change, although I used to spend a lot of time having to convince people about this. But we're clearly seeing now something fundamental going on with the climate in terms of the heating of the planet. But this is just keep it in perspective, this is essentially CO2 for the last 2,000 years in the atmosphere. And it really starts in the Industrial Revolution very clearly and is going off the chart. Now, the reason I'm kind of basically saying that is that direction is not good. And we don't really know how to, so our challenge of what we're trying to do to keep the temperature from getting into catastrophic range is somehow we got to bring that CO2 down. And so this period that we're entering into the next 30 years is going to essentially be fundamentally about that. At some core level, so many things are going to be worked around this, and it's going to, you can say maybe 10 years ago or 20 years ago, you people could kind of ignore it, but this is going to, no matter what your politics or what you want to do, it's essentially going to go in there. In a way that is anyhow, this is what's going to structure a lot of things here. So, oops, sorry. That's what I get. Oh, the other thing I want to say here is burgeoning capital. Essentially, the question is, do we have enough capital to actually pull off this kind of transformation? And the answer is actually yes. In fact, if you basically take right now in the world stock exchanges right now, there's about 90 trillion, that's with a T, $90 trillion is sloshing around all the different stock markets around the world. And here you can see the New York Stock Exchange, NASDAQ, but also all other exchanges, including the European and the ones in Asia. The point is, we need about, my understanding from people I know in climate change, we need about 5 trillion with a T, a year shifted towards essentially the clean energy climate transformation. It would be better to have more and do it quicker. But anyhow, the point is we need to redirect like 5 trillion to 10 trillion, I would say, in resources away from, let's say, investments in oil and new into other kinds of things that can scale up these technologies. They're starting to bite. It's doable. It's happening. In fact, the people I know are plugged in essentially impact investing and all kinds of things. We are watching essentially the super tanker of global finance is finally starting to shift in ways. We watched the coal industry kind of buckle and collapse. I think oil is in this decade is going to go through a similar transformation, and we're going to watch the kind of a lot of capital start moving to these business opportunities, because as I laid out to you, man, there is going to be a lot of money to be made in this world. The other thing I think is inexorable is Chinese superpower. This wasn't the case 25 years ago. This, by the way, I was a foreign correspondent. One of my things is I was a foreign correspondent for Newsweek in Asia in essentially the 80s, late 80s, early 90s, before I went to Wired. And in fact, this is Shanghai. It did not exist when I was there. barely. And this has actually come up overnight, essentially, as China has actually transformed. They have done some amazing things. So we can't think, I think of them as frenemies. There's a kind of a friendly side. They're part of our supply chains. They're also kind of now challenging us in many kind of ways. But one of the things they did do is they brought 800 million peasants out of severe poverty, less than $1.50 a day, into essentially what is a global middle class or kind of working class kind of situation. It was an incredible thing. It led to the whole world's poverty rate going down dramatically into a much more manageable thing. On the other hand, they've also been laying the groundwork for infrastructure that will play out for the next 30 years. Oops, in that case, I just wanted to show you that one. This is just the total length of high-speed railways in China. We're trying to get a high-speed railway in California. It's the hardest thing to do. It's the only place in the United States even trying to do it right now. We can't even get, like, from San Francisco to LA. They have meanwhile laid over 35,000 kilometers of high-speed rail, and essentially, which is knitting together society in different ways. And this is just one metric of many. But anyhow, China is going to be a huge shift in what happens. Total urbanization. I want to just touch on this briefly for you folks, because this is your business. And essentially, you're going to have to rebuild pretty much all cities in the world, including the ones in the developed world that are already kind of built. Because we got to move a lot more people into cities, and not just because we're forcing them, because they're coming. Essentially, this is essentially, in the history of the world, most people have lived in rural areas. That changed in about 2010, where essentially now more people started living in cities around the entire world in 2010, and it is going up. And there is no way this is stopping in any kind of severe way that we can see. That is essentially what put out to 2050, how many people will become cresting in rural areas. And this is essentially the urban population. Basically, it's going to hit by 2050. Basically, 70% of all people in the world will be in cities in 2050. By the way, that's even in the developed world. In the America, they think by 2030, there will only be about 10 to 15% of Americans will live in rural areas compared to what's going to happen in cities. And we're already seeing that. The population is an urban one. And of course, Europe, it's even denser. So anyhow, the point is, cities are going to have to build a unbelievable amount of sustainable kind of housing and all kinds of things to deal with that thing. Now, this is a kind of feeling of what happens when you jam the cities. But this is another really encouraging trend, actually, is that when you think about middle class in the world, middle class are essentially not what you think of in the West of middle class, but middle class in the world is essentially someone who can buy a scooter, can maybe get a refrigerator, can get an air conditioner, and has a little bit of savings so they're not living hand to mouth every day. Turns out, it turns out that we essentially have now got half the world in that situation. Just happened just this last decade. And in fact, if you combine super poor people, like less than $1.50 a day, to vulnerable people less than about $10 a day, that's essentially equal to that global middle class and rich, which is essentially the people in pretty much all you watching this, essentially what in the West is essentially a developed country. But this in just 30, and then by 2030, this is 10 years now, we're expected to go almost 2 billion more people into that global middle class. And in fact, when you compare it to where it was today, the smaller thing being essentially what it is now, we're going to grow that middle class and grow the rich for that matter, and we're going to shrink the vulnerable and shrink the poor. And this is, again, based on very reliable kind of data that we can see. And this is a good thing. Middle class people essentially stabilize societies. Middle class people do a lot of positive things, including one of the things about moving into urban areas and becoming more middle class is the role of women has changed very dramatically. And I think in the next 30 years here, we're going to see very much something that started in the West, which again was a world historical thing in the last 40 years of essentially women roughly equalizing in the developed world and particularly the West. One reflection of that is the lowering of birth rates, which has dramatically dropped in developed countries. But essentially, we've watched the whole world has come down. And in fact, the projections are going to continue to come down. And even the less developed kind of countries, let's say those in Africa, are coming down on this trend too. So essentially, we're watching, and this is a good example of when women don't have to have 8 kids or 5 kids, essentially, they have 1 or 2. It opens up their economic prospects. It stabilizes society. It's a very good thing all the way around, not just for women, but for the world. This is happening. Again, yet another positive thing. Now, so what this is really kind of, I'm trying to stress to you is the next 30 years, besides these inexorable developments coming together and coming together in really interesting synergistic ways, we are going to go through what is essentially a transformation of our technology base, our transformation of our essentially economy, our transformation of our society, essentially our politics, and many of the things that essentially are how we're going to organize our lives. We're in it now, folks. This isn't like, well, wouldn't it be cool to do this? It's happening. We're in it. This next 30 years is going to be an incredible thing. And I will just say to kind of finish here a little bit, is that if you look out beyond even those 30 years across the century, and this has a lot to do with, again, think of your kids. Anyone who has a kid, they're going to be playing until 2100. These climate impacts are going to viscerally impact them. All these developments I just laid to you is essentially structuring their lives. They are too also going to go through a transformation, but even on a bigger sense, because I think throughout the course of the century, we're going to see a transformation on even a bigger scale. And I'll give you this one little thing without going too much into it, is that when you go back to the last time we saw essentially fundamental system changes on a core level was essentially the Enlightenment, which is roughly 1680 to 1800 in Europe and America. This is a kind of the founding fathers period. It was men dominated that stage. But when we talk about the founding generation of America, that was the latter phase of the Enlightenment and really about a foundational innovation in democracy, in governing, which was democracy, representative democracy. But there was essentially in that period, particularly coming out of Europe and a lot of it in Great Britain too, is we essentially invented steam engines, essentially mechanical engines, which structured, that was the core tool of the future. We invented kind of digging up, started with coal, then it got to oil, then it got to natural gas, carbon energies. We then invented the Industrial Revolution, industrial processes, all the kind of things around that, which essentially created a crazy amount of explosion of kind of goods all over the world. We invented financial capitalism, essentially ways to take money and reliably invest it and get money back and accrue. That was, it didn't happen before. Essentially, Isaac Newton, weirdly, was the master of the mint in England, which actually kind of cracked the model for how to actually get a stable kind of financial capitalism going. But anyhow, we invented financial capitalism and we invented representative democracy. That was essentially the American contribution. Is like, before this, kings running things was from ever, in human history. And then we said, hey, this is a fundamentally different way to do it. And boom, we did that in the French Revolution. Anyhow, fundamental change and ultimately a sense of the nation state. These are meta innovations. These are innovations that were world historical and they define our life till this day. And in fact, every one of those, though, is kind of past its prime and is getting us into troubles, including carbon energies screwing up the planet. Industrial revolution is filling the oceans with plastic. Financial capitalism has got insane inequalities where, a handful of billionaires own as much as 40% of the rest of the world. I mean, it's kind of gotten to, and my financial representative democracy, you can't get anything done in America. We're just paralyzed because of these arcane rules that were devised by these guys in wigs, in the kind of the late, in 80s. This is why I think what we're in, and this is kind of the big picture way, is I think in our era, from the introduction of computers in 1980 to 2100 here, through this century, including these critical 30 years we're into now, we're going to see something close to the Enlightenment. It'll be something on a fundamental system change kind of thing that essentially is what I call the transformation. I use that word literally to kind of emulate the Enlightenment, and who knows, it'll pick up. But anyhow, just think of it as a comparable kind of way to think about our future. And so every one of those fundamental things are going to be superseded by our era's version of this. So theirs was mechanical engines, ours is clearly digital computers. We're going to reorganize everything around digital computers. We're well into it, but essentially the civilization that emerges will be all digital. We are making this transition. I made an argument there, and I think it's a pretty powerful one, that we're going to watch a very different set of clean energies. And really, we're going to run off energy off the sun. potentially some kind of nuclear fusion and other ways to supplement that. But it's very different than the carbon energies. We're going to essentially go, they did their industrial revolution, we're going to do our biological revolution. We're already in the early days of it. It's just beginning. We're going to be able to redesign many, many things, hopefully ethically, hopefully kind of carefully. But essentially that world is one that your kids are going to basically work in, and they're going to have to work out the ethics of that. Do we actually start tweaking humans? Do we knock out kind of genetically passed on diseases? Do we even push it even further? Do we get more, enhance ourselves in some kinds of ways? A lot of interesting questions on the horizon. Financial capitalism, I think we're going to have some kind of sustainable capitalism, one, to get the externalities of the kind of environmental damage that's coming out. Just, no one's paying for essentially the sewer that's going up into the air. That'll be part of it, but also sustainable in that I think it's got to spread wealth differently through society to actually have a stable, sustainable way for these societies to work long term. We're going to have some kind of evolution of our democracy and some kind of way that we govern ourselves. It's nuts that you wouldn't have some way to incorporate essentially these incredibly powerful new tools, which are transforming all these other industries, and not have it transform the way we govern and ultimately kind of cast our vote or our ideas of how we want to see the society go. That's the hardest one to kind of envision. And then ultimately, I think we're going to see some kind of global governance. Not in some big scary big brother, one guy runs the world kind of thing, but there's some kind of level of planetary coordination that's going to happen over the course of the century. It's the only way to go with one little planet to kind of work in a sustainable way. These are the big ideas. These are things your kids are going to master. These are the things we don't know how to do, particularly we know some of them, but not others. That's an exciting thing to come. And so to kind of end here, which is, I want to just say that far from it being this gloom and doom, oh my God, the future is so bleak, and do we even want to bring kids in the world and all that kind of stuff you're seeing in the media all the time, and this kind of look at your 2 inches in front of your face kind of way of thinking about the world. I think when you look expansively and open-mindedly at the next 30 years, if not the rest of the century, we are heading into what could be an absolute extraordinary time, a time of just really transformational change, which is disruptive and going to be difficult for a lot of folks. But on the other hand, ultimately moving in a direction which I think is going to really be able to solve many of the challenges of our time and actually create a world that I think people are going to want to live in. And I really think that, let's say, in 50 or 100 years or 500 years from now, or, going back to Asimov, 1,000 years from now, when people look back, they're going to look back just like they look back in the kind of Enlightenment. They're going to go, that period of that kind of mid to early, kind of mid 21st century, that's when the world went really fully digital, kind of did and got us into this digital age, essentially. And then they're going to say, and that's when the world went global, when we really kind of connected up the world and worked on a planetary scale for the first time in human history, but the way that we've been operating ever since. And they're going to say, and that's when the world went sustainable. It's like when we finally figured out how to actually build the human systems that essentially are going to work for the vast majority of people over the long haul. That's when they finally did it. And they're going to say that final thing is like, that was the time of the transformation. What a time to be alive. And so you should just think about that, think about how we'll be seen in the future, and then appreciate what an amazing time you are all living in and what you got to do starting today. And with that, I'm going to say thank you. And actually just say, if you do want to get a hold of me, different ways through my website there or Twitter, other ways. And looking forward to a little conversation here about some questions if you have any.
So Peter, on behalf of CIDCI, I would really want to thank you for a very stimulating conversation with a lot of ideas. It's interesting to see how you're thinking about the future, the history of the future. I think all I can say is speaking for CIDCI and our community, it's very exciting what you presented us to think about. And so what I want to do is I want to make one question to you and then turn it over for other questions, and then do a little bit of a summary at the end, and which hopefully accurately reflects some of your big ideas. But so with that, I since we are in the design and construction industry, and all the things that you have talked about the future, particularly when you get into the started thinking about globalization and all the other factors you're talking about in terms of energy. How do you see, what do you see in the future history for design and construction industry?
Well, this is actually kind of tapping into a lot of the work I'm doing right now, front of mind with kind of what I'm doing with Autodesk. Again, I'm not working in terms of I'm not an employee of theirs, but I've been brought in as a senior fellow to kind of look at what they're doing and trying to give them some ideas of where they're going. But it's kind of applicable to the whole industry. Well, I mean, I think what's happening with you folks is there's been this delayed, I mean, again, I'm just learning and you guys know much better than I, but there seems to be a delay for some good reasons. You know, you're a physical oriented kind of construction industry, but the design is digital and you've got architects and you got kind of designers kind of working stuff. And then you got this physical world. And so what you have to essentially do is figure that jump out. And it's been interesting. I was literally just watched someone who presented to Autodesk essentially this Dusty Robotics. I don't know if you heard about this, but essentially a little robot that essentially can, which is the founder was laying it out to us, is you can take a building site where you take the whole platform and the robot can actually take the design of the what you normally have in your three-dimensional kind of CAD thing, and basically lays it out literally on the floor. And so you can just come in and just put exactly on the floor where the thing is and connect up the pieces anyhow. And so it's just one example I'm just watching right now. There is essentially a leap being taken right now from the kind of part of your world that has been digitized, which is essentially the design side, if just I had to schematize, into the hit the ground running kind of side. That's one thing that's going on. The other thing I think is really interesting is I think the pressures on housing and on essentially rebuilding cities around electric transport is going to be the other thing that's going to fundamentally change this thing. We're not going to need all these freaking parking decks, in major cities to what used to be the individual driving into that thing. That's kind of for a bunch of reasons. There's going to be working from home, but also there's going to be autonomous vehicles that are essentially electric, and they're just going to be able to bring in whoever goes in, and you're going to essentially not have your own car, and you're not going to have to sit it downtown, or for that matter, on your in your house at home. So there's going to be essentially a restructuring around these fundamental shifts. Plus these social pressures of like opening up more housing, not just in the developed world, but also, in fact, especially in the kind of developing world. This on that, you're just going to watch the pressures be so much that it's going to force the innovation in a way. A lot of times innovation comes from just entrepreneurs kind of getting ahead of the game and pulling everybody with them. And a lot of times it also comes from essentially outsiders forcing kind of things to happen. And I think the climate change forcing, I think the pressures on housing, I think a lot of things are going to start to really hit you guys. So I'd say robotics hitting, I think a lot of essentially prefab kind of pre-built things, modular building. All I think is going to grow fast. I think the synthetic biology thing is going to be a huge piece. It's early yet, but I think the kinds of materials you're going to use and essentially how we're going to grow them or how we're going to develop them and the kind of capabilities of that material might be hugely too. I think there's big fronts that are not questionable right now. It's like, how are we going to kind of deal with this cement and kind of concrete and its contribution to climate change? There's a lot of kind of challenges too, but I think what's interesting about this period is there's a ton of energy is going to be put into this, energy that previously has not been coming into your industry. And I think the pressures are going to be on you guys in good ways, actually kind of kicking, but also resources are going to shift differently to try new things. And it's just going to be a really exciting time to be in the construction industry. One of the reasons I came to Autodesk for this project was I was fascinated by the industries that you serve. If we're going to pull off climate change, if we're going to basically deal with it in some way that we can get a handle on global warming and ultimately adapt to climate change, we're going to need architects, construction firms, engineers, manufacturing kind of facilities. A lot of the places that you guys are dealing with are going to be the front edge of it. And it's where essentially a lot of the innovation has to come, and it will come. And in fact, it's already starting to happen. And so that's why I think it's an exciting time to be in your field. And but then I'm an optimist. I'm an optimist, so I might be maybe more optimistic than if I really understood the nuances that you guys do. But anyhow, that's me.
You said the future was positive. So with that, maybe we have time for one or two questions. But thank you so much, Peter. Thank you very much. Archie?
Hi, Amir Sharif has asked a question, which talks about integrated project delivery, which is an idea that all sides of a contract would come together and work. And I don't know if you were familiar with that specifically, but I'm just wondering if you might have some advice. So Amir asks, can you speak to the role of contracts in the construction industry, their combative nature and opportunities to create more collaborative approaches? Yeah, I don't think it's limited only to the construction industry. Let me be clear, but anyway, that's obviously.
Yeah, no, it's one of the things that both as a person who's had people working on my house, and I built this actually thing here. I general contracted this little structure in my house. So I've personally said it, but also I'm watching it more as I get deeper into it. That crazy kind of tapestry of different subcontractors and everybody and all working on their own, and they're not sharing the data. And anyhow, it is kind of a nightmarish thing just from the outside. When I look at it, like, oh my God. But I think the positive thing that's happening, there's several positive things happening, which I think is interesting, is, and Autodesk is one example. I don't want to tout them, but I'm just saying I know them. I mean, they're going to the cloud. They are essentially a platform company. I think a lot of the leading companies now are realizing we just got to get everything in the cloud. We got to get everything digitized, and we got to be working on interoperable systems. Just like, everything's, the media industries work that way, the music industries that work that way, we've seen how these kind of things work. And there's battles around it, and there's standards, and there's like, who's going to be ascended and who's going to play out and whose platform is the best platform. I mean, that stuff is part of the churn of essentially any economy. But I think the ultimate thing that's happening is you're all going to get on the same similar platforms or interoperable platforms. And so a lot of that craziness, I think, is going to get ironed out or coordinated. And then this is the thing, which gets a little bit of a leap of trust. But I mean, AI, I think AI is such a kind of foreign way to understand how technology works, kind of independently of humans at some level. And it's so it's hard for outsiders to really wrap their heads around this. But I actually think AI is going to be very helpful in this. I think essentially you're going to have AI that's going to be able to track many of the different pieces that some managers' head is exploding trying to do it, and be able to kind of coordinate on a kind of level that would be kind of unprecedented for what your field is. But I think in the next decade, you can imagine this doing all digital, getting on platforms, AI kind of helping coordinate. And then I think there's also got to be some kind of standards or something where the sharing of information. I mean, everything. I think what gets bottles up a lot of these projects, apparently, from what I understand, is that no one even understands each other's bids and all that stuff. I mean, you got to figure out a way that's just essentially open good. One of my mantras from the mid-90s that I've been preaching in technology business is open is good, closed is bad. And it's happened with all these different, industries have gone through something similar. And I think you guys have hit that point, which is, it's just like, there's so much more to benefit from openly connecting data and sharing information in win-win situations, that, and the ease of it doing it with it being all digital and all that kind of stuff, I think is going to just overwhelmingly win. Or it'll be forced from the outside too, because, you just can't have the kind of construction projects that just the amount of money we're spending on these things, and housing particularly, it's just, it's just not sustainable at some level. And so I think it's through prods and through kind of, your own internal innovation, or potentially through outside kind of help or things. I mean, I think you might see a lot of public money now going into low-income housing. I think you're going to see a lot of, climate money going into all kinds of new infrastructure things. And so a lot of what you're going to be doing might be tied to the federal government's going to say, hey, if we're going to do this, you got to keep the costs low. And basically everyone has to adopt this standard. And, if you don't want to play that game, fine, but you're not going to play this game, and so you're going to see, or California, state of California will do it, or whatever it is, you're going to start to see these new, essentially, frameworks of what you're going to need to play in this pot of a lot of money that's going to basically be moving into these spaces. So anyhow, there's different ways. It's going to, just one thing I just want to finish with, and I know you got to go, but change like this is extremely messy. It's also very confusing. And I would just say, in terms of that strategic sea change, is what I was trying to lay out to you, is this emergent next thing that's happening. And so the more you can kind of try to disengage or kind of let go of the kind of ways you've been doing stuff in that past kind of period, for all your own internal reasons, but also the reasons that are way bigger than you, bigger system reasons, that the earlier you get into that next thing, or get your mindset around what's emerging, the better off you're going to be. And the earlier you make the move, the quicker it's going to be. is better for you. The more you go, I would say it pays off more. It's going to take some risks. Not everything's going to work, but that's just how you play the game of innovation. And you guys are totally capable, ready to go. And I am going to watch you folks. And so over the next 30 years, if you come me back in 30 years, we can have an interesting conversation about it, how you pull it off.
So thank you, Peter. Do we have time for one more quick question?
I'm going to ask one really quick one because I think it's so key, and it's from Troy Thompson, who's on the board of CIDCI. He asks, culture or technology, is one more determinative of our future state than the other, or does one come first?
Culture or technology? What are the two? Interesting one. Again, could go into a lot of stuff, but I know the time is tight here. I'm one of those people that actually looks at history and looks at the future, for that matter, is a little more technology centric than a lot of people. And I think technology opens up things and creates situations that the culture ultimately adapts to. And I think it's rare, although not unprecedented, that essentially cultures are so dominant that they can kind of kill new technologies or stop them. I mean, we've seen it in ancient China and various kind of different things in history, but in general, our understanding of science and technologies as they go are going to essentially shape what comes more, not inevitably, but I would say don't expect, keep an eye on where technology is going, because it's going to structure, if not, one culture might opt out, but most won't. And essentially, it's a better barometer on where things are going than essentially looking to what do people think? Because people don't know what they think until they see it. It was like, if you would have told people, anyhow, just say, I can go on and on about this, but I would just say, but I'm a technophile, and I'm also one that has spent my life studying technologies, but I would say track that rather than where is the culture right now. Culture will change.
Peter, it's been so fabulous to spend the morning with you. I'm going to turn it over now to Stuart Ekblad, the chair of CIDCI, for some closing words.
So thank you, Margie. And again, Peter, thank you. I really, again, for speaking for everyone and CIDCI, this has just been fabulous. It's really opened up, I think, a lot of our thinking. Just a couple of major points. One was positive, came out loud and strong, and right now today, that's an important message. So thank you for that. It's quite uplifting for the direction that we're all thinking about. Clearly, I think you made it clear about that we're headed to the digital world. I actually personally liked the quote unquote the new age of enlightenment. I think that's something to really look forward to. So without a doubt, some of the things that, though, I think areas where you really sort of broadened our horizon is just even beyond the digital world in some ways, is really the AI and the importance of that, the accelerated innovation, clean energy, and the understanding in the biologic opportunities, and basically the new majorities. I think when you put all those together, there is a lot about products, there's a lot about learning, there's a lot of education, there is a lot of opportunity in our industry to adopt or to learn more about those areas. So, which could lead certainly to a better built environment. So there are so many nuggets that you gave us today that I could go on and on, probably not as long as you could make it much clearer than I could. But I just wanted to really thank you that I think in the time that we've had, and it was a short period of time, I think you've really given us a lot to think about. And then finally I'll end with your focus on the whole global impact. I think it's very inspiring to think about how energy and how the different our different cultures are, and being able to speak one language through technology, and how that will affect basically the energy, how poverty might be dropping, how urbanization is going up, really helps us to start to think about the impact to the built environment. So I hope that at least hit some of your major points. In summary, I personally learned a tremendous amount, really inspired about what you brought to us. So thank you very much.
Well, it's been great to be with you, and good luck.
Thank you.
Thanks. We'll look forward to seeing everyone on this call tomorrow when we do a session for CIDCI called Innovations Partner Failure. Something we don't talk about enough within the design and construction industry. We'll see you at 8 a.m. Tomorrow morning as we continue 1 week of great events for the CIDCI Fall Forum. In the meantime, stay safe. Thank you again, Peter, for giving us an amazing start to our week together. Thanks, everyone.
Good. Terrific. Thank you very much. Thank you.